Well, good day everybody, this is Joe and welcome back to the garage workshop. And I was going to do a follow-up video here about this Sears 4Cast12 typewriter, which is a Smith Corona 6 series. And you might remember the last video I talked a little bit about is good enough, and what does it take to keep our fleet of typewriters in good enough shape to use, and do they have to be perfect, etc. One of the things I talked about was working on this machine and working on the escapement problems that it had. And after I finished that video, I went back to do some more testing on this machine, and it still had some intermittent escapement issues that I thought were resolved but weren't. So I had to dig deeper into the machine, and I do believe I really have it fixed now, but I don't want to take it all apart, but I do want to show you how I fix the escapement, and hopefully the instructions will be clear enough for you guys that it'll help you if you have a 6 series Smith Corona also. Okay, just to recap some of the features on this machine, this has the half space feature, so every time you press it down the carriage moves 1/2 space, and then it has the repeat spacer, which causes the carriage to repeatedly move rapidly 1 space at a time. And as you might recall, the main problem with this was intermittent skipping, more so when the touch selector is on the light position, and more so with right after the keys on the left side of the keyboard are hit, and especially hit hard. Now, the secondary problem of this color selector being stubborn to move, it's actually easier to move now that I've fixed the other problem. So there was some interrelationship there, but I'm not really dealing with that problem. That is a minor nuisance. The main problem is the skipping. And so let me show you what I'm going to do. I'm going to flip this typewriter over on its face down to take the back cover off. And I usually have a heavy padded towel. This towel is my typewriter grungy towel that I use to degrease typewriters. It gets all kinds of grease and solvents in it, so you don't want to take a shower with this thing, certainly. So let me flip this over. This pads the typewriter. It protects the top of it from being too badly scratched, or if you put it on a hard surface face down, you might break something. So kind of just move the towel over here. I'm going to lock the carriage in the middle position with this carriage lock, and I'm simply going to flip it over like that, and we'll take the bottom screws off. And these 4 panhead slotted screws come off easy enough, and the bottom pops right off like that. Okay, here is the mechanical part of the typewriter exposed. Very easy to get to. This is one of the things I love about the Smith Corona 5 and 6 series. Okay, deep down in the escapement mechanism is this plate right here, and this plate is designed to pivot. Let's see if I can do it with my screwdriver. It's supposed to pivot up and down like that. And it has 2 dogs, 2 arms. One of them is this hook-shaped arm secured by this shoulder screw, and the other one is this arm right here, which underneath that spring, you can see the other end of it moving there, right here. That arm is also secured by a shoulder screw on the bottom side. And what's important to note about this is those shoulder screws are secured by these locking nuts. This one here, and on the other side of this shoulder screw is the same locking nut. The problem with this was this particular right-hand dog was not resetting itself. It was intermittently hanging up, and so what I have to do is remove this whole pivoting plate right here. To do that, the first thing you're going to want to do is to remove this shoulder screw. This bell crank is for the repeat spacer mechanism, which is the button is right here. You remove this screw, the bell crank slides right out of this guide right here, and then you're going to have this long wire, and when you lift the bell crank out and the wire out, you'll be able to disconnect the other end of this wire, which is right here. It'll disconnect from the hole in this arm right here. Okay, and you'll just set those parts aside. You'll set this control rod, bell crank, and shoulder screw aside. Now the second thing you're going to want to do is this whole bracket assembly right here you have to take out. And to do that, you're going to want to first disconnect this spring, and I usually put a thin jeweler's screwdriver in between one of the links of the spring, and then using a dental pick, I pick the hook off this hole and reset the spring, release the spring, so its spring is now attached to right here. Okay, it shouldn't go anywhere. Then the second thing you're going to do is take off this E-clip on the right side of this shaft here. Be sure you don't drop it. And then the third thing you'll do is this little rod, which is right here, hooks around a hole right here in the end of this angle. You're going to disconnect that rod, and it connects down to a linkage down below, and if it falls off, it's fairly easy to get back on. But just lean that hooked wire back. You can even tape it to this bell if you want to. So when you take off the E-clip to release this rod from this bracket, you're going to want to loosen this bracket. And to loosen this bracket, you're going to want to set the typewriter up on its back. To gain access to these two screws down here, you're going to loosen these two screws, and this whole angle bracket that the rod attaches to, this whole angle bracket comes out, and this frees up the whole thing to take out. So once you've done that, then this whole assembly here, which includes this angle bracket and this bracket, all of that will remove. You have to slide it to the right, slide this end of the shaft out of this bracket. It'll all slide right and come out, and that gives you access to the escapement dog, the pivoting mechanism there. Next, before we can loosen up the set screws for the escapement rocker, you want to disconnect this spring, and I typically disconnect the end on the escapement rocker itself, so you can see it underneath here. You want to use a fine slotted jeweler's screwdriver, put it in the last link of the spring, and then use a dental pick, and you can pick out the spring very carefully and just leave the spring hanging from the other pivot point. Now we're ready to loosen up the left-hand pivot point of the escapement rocker so we can remove the whole escapement rocker and service it. We have to loosen the left-hand pivoting screw, which is right here. There's two pivots for this escapement dog rocker. The one on the right is here. There is a set screw and a lock nut, and the one on the left is right underneath here. So to get to this left one, I'm going to take a long skinny screwdriver through the opening on the left side of the frame, and I'm going to run that screwdriver right into the slotted set screw head here. And then you're going to want to take a little carburetor wrench, an open end wrench, and you're going to want to loosen that nut to loosen the set screw. And you're going to back off the set screw. You don't want to unthread it completely. You're going to back it off enough to where this whole dog rocker can slide to the right slightly, and then you'll be able to remove it. Now, once you remove that dog rocker, you're going to want to clean and degrease the pivots of the screws, the two rocker arms, the left and the right one here. You want to degrease them thoroughly with a toothbrush and a degreasing agent. The trick to this is setting these screws right. Now, I'm not going to disconnect this and take it out because it took me a long time to get this fixed, but hopefully I can describe it for you adequately. The screw itself, it's a shoulder screw. And what you want to do is loosen the nut on the back side of the screw, for instance this nut, and then the head of the screw, which is on the other side of this one, but it looks the same as this. You want to loosen the head of that screw, and then tighten it up until the arm doesn't move anymore, and then back it off just slightly until the arm can freely rotate. Okay? Just so it freely rotates, but not too much slop. Then tighten the nut without turning the screw head anymore. You tighten the nut on the back of the screw, and the ideal position that you should be in when you're done is the dog rocker can easily pivot on its own. There's easy pivoting without any hanging up, but there's no up and down slop. And when you try to turn the screw head with moderate force with a screwdriver, it won't turn. You don't want it loosening up on its own. So that's the ideal condition for both of these dog rocker screws, is it can pivot freely, but it can't come loose. The locking nut is locking it in place like that. So once you have that and you thoroughly degrease the rockers so that they slide easily without hanging up, now what you want to do is you want to reinstall this, and essentially the process is the reverse of what it was getting it out. You're going to want to slip it down in here and get the hole in the right side of the rocker onto the set screw right here. And then on the left side, the one that's underneath here, that's harder to see, you're going to want to take your screwdriver again from the left side, and you're going to want to start threading in the set screw until it engages into the hole on the left side of the rocker. And then you're going to, this is another tricky adjustment that it's important to do right, is you want to tighten that set screw down so that two conditions are met. Number one, this rocker can pivot up and down freely. It can fall under its own weight. It's very important. I'm trying to get it here. It's very important that it falls under its own weight. Okay, that's with this spring disconnected, by the way. It falls under its own weight. Just falls on its own weight, but it's tight enough so that there's no side-to-side motion of the rocker. So you're going to want to tighten that set screw so that it starts to hang up, it won't pivot under its own weight, and then back it off enough so it freely moves, and then while keeping the screw, the set screw, from turning using your screwdriver, you're going to want to tighten that locking nut with a carburetor wrench, an open-end wrench. And then test to make sure that this escapement rocker pivots under its own weight. It's able to fall down. Once that is put back in place, you want to reconnect the spring here using a fine flathead screwdriver and a dental pick. Reconnect it back to the hole here on the arm. When you're done there, you're going to reinstall this whole mechanism. You're going to set this shaft down into the hole in this bracket here, and then you're going to tip the machine onto its back like this, so you can gain access to reinstall the two screws that hold this angle bracket in place that the right side of the shaft goes into. So you'll kind of fit the right side of the shaft into the angle bracket. Things will be kind of loose and wobbly. The left end of this shaft is in its bracket. Then you'll put the screws down in here, get them pretty close to snug, and make sure everything's adjusted right. Then tighten these down. Then you can reinstall your E-clip on the end of this shaft to keep it secured, and then you can reinstall your spring that goes from here underneath the shaft, reinstall it on the hole in the frame using a fine flathead screwdriver and a dental pick. And then lastly, this little hook here that hooks over this end of the bracket that goes down in the mechanism down there, you want to, as I recommended earlier, tape it up so on the bell so it doesn't fall out of the other end, and put it back on the loop there. And then lastly is reconnecting the rod for the repeat spacer. And to reconnect the repeat spacer rod, I usually start with the rod itself, and you slip it down this way and hook it around the end of the hole in that bracket right there. That's out of focus right there. Then the other end of the rod, go ahead and hook it around the bell crank, and then slip the bell crank underneath this piece right here and get the hole lined up. There's going to be two holes in the frame. It's the left hand of the two that has the threads, and this is a shoulder screw, and you'll tighten it down so that it can still pivot freely when you're using the repeat spacer lever. And that's getting the repeat spacer back in place. So from there, you should have a functioning escapement rocker plate. And the final touch to this whole thing is going to be adjusting the escapement trip point. And that is done by the angle at which this piece, this arm, is bent. So that's part of the escapement rocker, but you have to bend this arm, bend it close to where it angles here with a sturdy pair of needle nose pliers. Now, I don't have a 6 series manual yet for the 6 series, but I'm using the escapement adjustment mechanism for the 5 series in Ted Monk's Typewriter Repair Bible. And on page 211, they talk about the escapement trip point. And the escapement trip point, again, is adjusted by bending this arm that I showed you. And they're saying that it should trip to where when you move the type bar toward the printing position, when the face of the type is even with the tip ends of the type guide, it should trip the escapement. Now my typewriter, I have it adjusted, this one, so that it's tripped slightly later. And so that's about even with the tip ends, but mine trips a little bit closer. Now that might be too close for some people, but I erred on the side of making it a little bit less sensitive because of the skipping issue I had. It was sort of tripping too soon and it was too sensitive. And then they're saying when it lets off, in other words, after it trips and it prints, when it lets off, that click there, that should be about 7/16, and that's pretty close. That's just under a ½ inch. It looks pretty close, but my tripping point is a little bit closer than what they're saying, but I'm doing that because I'm trying to avoid any of the skipping issues, and that looks like I've succeeded in that. There's one more adjustment you might want to be aware of for the repeat spacer. Okay, the repeat spacer is controlled by this guide rod from the repeat spacer bell crank and knob mechanism. And what it does is it basically pivots this whole shaft, and it takes this arm and it moves the arm up like this, and this spring-loaded arm or flexible arm that's on this rubber mount is what vibrates to do the repeat spacer. But what it's doing is there is a kind of a pawl mechanism down in here that raises up when you do the repeat spacer. This raises up and it interacts with the escapement to allow it to trip, and the limit as far as how far you can raise it up is set by this plastic set screw and locking nut, and that kind of controls how it goes. But one of the things I did in the process of trying to troubleshoot this was down in here there's a bracket that holds this whole assembly in place, and this bracket is held in place by two screws here and here, this plate. And there are slots underneath those two screws, and if you loosen the two screws you can slide this plate left and right, and that has a profound effect on how well the repeat spacer works. And if you get that misadjusted, what will happen is when you hit the repeat spacer, the carriage just goes and slides all the way to the right. It releases the carriage completely. So you have to be very careful. Don't adjust it unless you have to, but if you do, loosen the two screws, slide it one way, tighten the screws, and then test it. And don't leave them loose when you're testing, but you have to tighten it back down. Essentially, you're trying to adjust the pivot point here of this shaft that raises up, and make sure it can raise up all the way, and then you have to adjust the set point, the stopping point, with this plastic set screw and this locking nut. I only had to adjust it because I disconnected it later on, or in the process of trying to troubleshoot the escapement problem. Okay, let me try to tilt the machine forward enough to free the carriage, and I'll do the repeat spacer for you. So here's the guide rod that trips it, and it's going to pivot this arm up and release the mechanism, and then you'll see this arm vibrate on the rubber shock mount like that. Came to the end of the carriage there. So that's how the repeat spacer works. Now there's also a half spacer which is controlled from this guide arm, and it goes down into this mechanism here. I didn't have any problems with that, but that's basically half releasing the escapement that way. And of course the space bar. Now when you're typing a letter, a character, it's going to be moving this little arm here, which trips, again, this same arm that the space bar does. Like that. And so the angle that you bend this arm at determines the trip point, at which point, relative to how close the type bar is to the platen, it determines the trip point. Well, this was a brief little tutorial that I hope helps you guys and gives you some confidence if you want to service your 5 or 6 series Smith Corona. I would advise getting Ted Monk's Typewriter Repair Bible for the 5 or 6 series, and I gained confidence in being able to service this escapement problem and some of the other Smith Coronas in my collection really because of the high quality of Smith Corona's service manual and the illustrations they provide that really enables you to understand where the adjustment is and how to do it and all the interrelationships between those parts. But this is just a brief overview of what it takes to do some escapement work on the Smith Corona 6 series and 5 series. And hope this was helpful to you guys. And if you're curious about the typewriter repair Bibles, I'll leave a link down below to Ted Monk's website where you might be able to acquire one of those for yourselves. Okay, this is Joe Van Cleve, and until next time, you guys have yourselves a great day and happy typing, and stay creative. Bye-bye for now.